January 1962. Nam Yu, Laos, 17 kilometers from the Chinese border. CIA paramilitary officer Bill Young crouched in a bamboo longhouse, watching Hmong village chief Tubi Laifung examine the brick of raw opium with the practiced eye of a man who'd been harvesting poppies since childhood. Outside, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of an approaching H-34 Choctaw helicopter grew louder, its rotors beating against the mountain air at 8,000 feet. Young had flown into these mountains with $50,000 in cash, crisp $100 bills that meant absolutely nothing here, where the nearest bank was 3 days' walk through North Vietnamese army patrols and the local economy ran on silver, rice, and opium. "We need 300 fighters," Young said through his Hmong interpreter, a former French colonial scout named Vang Pao. "Armed, ready to move against the Pathet Lao by next week." Tubi set down the opium brick. 2 kilograms of sticky brown paste worth more than gold in these hills. He spoke in rapid Hmong, gesturing toward the valley below, where terraced poppy fields bloomed white and purple in the morning sun. "He says the men will fight," Vang Pao translated. "But American dollars buy nothing here. The traders who bring ammunition, the pilots who might fly supplies, they want opium. It is the only currency that works in the mountains." Young nodded slowly, calculating. Washington wanted a secret army to stop the communist advance through Laos. The Hmong wanted weapons, medicine, and rice. And the only thing that could bridge that gap was sitting on the bamboo table between them, the raw material of heroin that would, within a decade, flood American streets and transform Southeast Asia into the world's largest narcotics production zone. "Tell him we'll buy his opium," Young said, "all of it." Neither man realized they had just laid the first stone in an empire of addiction that would outlast the war, the CIA's presence, and every American soldier who would eventually come home with a needle in his arm. In the climate-controlled offices of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the arrangement seemed almost elegant in its simplicity. The year was 1961, and the agency faced an impossible mandate. Stop communist expansion in Laos without committing American ground troops, without congressional oversight, and without spending the hundreds of millions that a conventional military operation would require. "We're not buying opium," insisted William Colby, then CIA's Far East Division chief, during a classified briefing in late 1961. "We're facilitating indigenous resistance. If the local economy happens to involve opium cultivation, that's a separate matter from our mission objectives." The semantic gymnastics fooled no one in the room, but they provided the bureaucratic cover necessary for Operation Momentum, later expanded into Operation Barrel Roll, to proceed. The logic was bulletproof from a Cold Warrior's perspective. The Hmong Hill tribes were natural anti-communists, fiercely independent, superb guerrilla fighters, and already engaged in armed resistance against the Pathet Lao. They controlled vast stretches of the Laotian highlands along critical North Vietnamese supply routes, and they were desperately poor, with almost no cash economy. What they did have were poppies. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, had been cultivated in these mountains for centuries, long before the French colonial period, long before the Japanese occupation, long before any Westerners set foot in these valleys. For the Hmong, opium served multiple purposes: medicine, currency, a compact store of value that could be carried during their frequent migrations, and a cash crop that traveled well on the backs of mountain ponies where roads didn't exist. "The poppy fields solve our supply problem," explained Air America Logistics Coordinator George Doole in a memo that remained classified until 1994. "Traditional currencies are worthless in the highlands. Gold is too heavy for air operations. But opium has established trade routes, known values, and, critically, it's what our indigenous forces can actually produce." The mathematics seemed compelling. A Hmong fighter earned roughly $3 per month in American military aid. A figure so disconnected from reality it might as well have been monopoly money. But that same fighter could harvest 10 to 12 kilograms of raw opium annually from his family's small poppy plot, worth $150 in regional trade value. The CIA could purchase that opium for a fair price, providing immediate cash to Hmong families, then dispose of it through established trade networks, thereby funding guerrilla operations, ensuring tribal loyalty, and theoretically keeping the opium out of heroin refineries. Nobody asked where we planned to dispose of it. Retired CIA officer Anthony Poshepny, known as Tony Po, admitted in a 1988 interview. We told Washington what they wanted to hear. They pretended to believe us, and we built an army. By early 1962, that army numbered nearly 9,000 Hmong fighters, men, teenagers, even elderly villagers who could handle a rifle. They were organized into mobile strike groups, equipped with American weapons and supplied by Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline that operated the most sophisticated air logistics network in Southeast Asia. Air America pilots, many of them former military aviators earning $40,000 annually, 10 times a soldier's pay, flew everything from rice and ammunition to opium, though that last cargo item never appeared on official manifests. We called them soft rice shipments, recalled Air America pilot Neil Hansen. Burlap bags that went from village collection points to regional trading posts. What happened after that wasn't technically our concern. We were just the delivery service. The initial arrangement appeared to work brilliantly. Hmong fighters proved extraordinarily effective, conducting reconnaissance patrols, ambushing Pathet Lao supply columns, and rescuing downed American pilots. Villages that cooperated with the CIA received medicine, tools, and protection. The opium economy hummed along as it always had, except now American aircraft provided transportation that dramatically expanded market reach. Pentagon analysts celebrated the cost-effectiveness. $30 million annually to field a 10,000-man indigenous army versus $300 million for a single American division. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, speaking to the National Security Council in March 1962, called the Laotian operation the most efficient use of American power projection capability in Southeast Asia. What nobody calculated, or perhaps nobody wanted to calculate, was the exponential growth potential of a CIA-backed logistics network intersecting with one of the world's oldest narcotics trades. The Hmong grew opium. Air America flew opium. Chinese and Corsican traders refined opium into heroin, and American military personnel would soon provide the world's most lucrative customer base. The elegant solution was about to become an uncontrollable disaster. But in 1962, as the first American military advisors arrived in Vietnam and President Kennedy expanded covert operations throughout Southeast Asia, the CIA's Laotian operation seemed like a model of cost-effective intervention. "We genuinely believed we could control it," said George Duell decades later, his voice heavy with the weight of hindsight. "We thought we were smarter than the drug trade. We weren't." The roots of the Golden Triangle drug empire stretch back far before any CIA officer set foot in Laos. But the transformation from traditional highland agriculture to industrial-scale narcotics production required something the region had never possessed: modern air transportation, reliable logistics, and American institutional support. The French, during their colonial rule of Indochina, 1893 to 1954, had maintained a sophisticated working relationship with the region's opium economy. The Opium Regie, France's official monopoly on opium trade, generated 15 to 20% of colonial revenues in Indochina during the 1920s and 1930s. French intelligence services recruited hill tribe leaders by guaranteeing market access for their opium, creating precedents that CIA officers would later follow almost step by step. When France withdrew after the 1954 Geneva Accords, that infrastructure collapsed. Mountain traders reverted to ancient caravan routes, pony trains that took weeks to reach buyers in Thailand or Burma. Production remained localized, small-scale, and disconnected from international markets. The opium economy of the late 1950s looked virtually identical to the opium economy of the late 1850s. Subsistence farmers growing poppies as a survival crop, with minimal impact beyond regional networks. Enter the CIA's Far East Division, tasked in 1960 with stopping communist expansion in Laos through all necessary means short of American combat forces. The agency's approach drew heavily on successful operations in the Philippines, Hukbalahap Rebellion, and Guatemala, 1954 coup, but with a critical difference. The Laotian operation would need to be entirely self-financing and politically deniable. We studied the British experience in Malaya extensively, recalled William Lair, the CIA officer who designed the Hmong military training program. Hearts and minds, village security, economic development. But we couldn't get congressional appropriations. So we had to find alternative revenue streams. Those alternative revenue streams crystallized around Air America, established in 1950 as a CIA proprietary airline and expanded dramatically in 1959-1961. The airline operated a fleet that eventually included 26 C-123 provider cargo aircraft, 10,000-pound capacity, 30 C-47 and DC-3 transports, 6,000-pound capacity, 15 C-46 commandos, heavy lift capability, 50 plus helicopters, H-34s and UH-1s, multiple smaller stall, short takeoff and landing aircraft for mountain strips. This represented the most sophisticated air logistics capability in Southeast Asia, better than the Royal Lao Air Force, more extensive than South Vietnamese military aviation, and certainly more advanced than anything the Pathet Lao or North Vietnamese could field. Air America pilots, recruited from military aviation backgrounds and paid premium salaries, knew how to operate in impossible conditions. Mountain airstrips that were barely cleared bamboo platforms, landing zones under fire, precision drops to isolated villages. We could put 3 tons of cargo into a 1,200-foot dirt strip at 6,000-foot elevation in weather that grounded military aircraft, explained pilot Fred Walker. That capability changed everything about what was logistically possible in those mountains. The CIA's initial contact with Vang Pao, a Royal Lao Army major and Hmong leader, occurred in December 1960. Vang Pao, then 31 years old, commanded roughly 300 Hmong irregulars fighting the Pathet Lao in northeastern Laos. CIA officer Bill Lair met him at a makeshift airstrip near Padang and recognized immediately what the Pentagon had been searching for: a charismatic local commander with tribal authority, anti-communist credentials, and the ability to recruit thousands of fighters from kinship networks that stretched across northern Laos. Major Vang Pao can deliver 10,000 men, Lair cabled Langley in January 1961. He understands guerrilla warfare, he knows the terrain, and he has the loyalty of villages throughout the Hmong regions. He will require weapons, medical support, and economic assistance to his villages. He accepts that we cannot provide American troops. What Lair's cable didn't explicitly state, but everyone understood, was that economic assistance meant facilitating the opium trade that sustained Hmong villages. When President Kennedy approved the expansion of covert operations in Laos, National Security Action Memorandum 52, May 11, 1961, he authorized support for indigenous forces without detailed questions about revenue sources. By mid-1961, the CIA had established a pattern that would persist throughout the 1960s. Phase 1. Air America aircraft delivered weapons, ammunition, and rice to Hmong villages. Outbound flights often carried burlap bags listed on manifests as agricultural products, or simply left unlisted as local cargo. Phase 2. Village leaders like Tubi Laifung and Vang Pao purchased opium from individual farmers at fair market rates using American-supplied funds. This consolidated opium at collection points and established CIA officers as reliable buyers. Phase 3. The consolidated opium traveled via Air America to larger towns like Tieng, the CIA's secret base, known as Lima Site 20 Alternate, and then to Vientiane, where it entered established smuggling networks controlled by Corsican and Chinese syndicates. Phase 4. The opium reached heroin refineries, initially in Saigon and Bangkok, later in the Golden Triangle itself, where it was processed into heroin destined for international markets. The system's elegance lay in its deniability. At each stage, different actors handled the transaction. CIA officers could honestly say they purchased agricultural products from Hmong farmers. Air America pilots could truthfully claim they transported authorized cargo under CIA manifest. The heroin laboratories and trafficking networks operated entirely separate from American agencies. Nobody had direct responsibility for the final product. We created a perfect example of what economists call moral hazard, admitted Frank Snepp, a CIA analyst who later wrote extensively about the agency's Indochina operations. Every individual transaction seemed defensible, but the system as a whole was building the infrastructure for industrial-scale heroin production. The construction of Long Tieng exemplified this transformation. In 1962, Long Tieng was a small Hmong village in a remote valley. By 1964, after CIA engineers enlarged the airstrip and built warehouses, command facilities, and housing, it had become the second busiest airport in Laos, busier than the capital's commercial airport. More than 300 Air America flights weekly landed at Long Tieng, carrying everything from howitzers to soft drinks. And opium, added pilot Neil Hansen bluntly. Let's not pretend otherwise. We flew opium out on probably 20 to 30% of outbound flights, sometimes as legitimate cargo that we'd purchased from villages, sometimes as unlisted weight that local commanders loaded after manifest inspection. Either way, American aircraft provided the transportation infrastructure. The CIA also provided protection that traffickers had never enjoyed before. Air America flights operated under State Department diplomatic cover, meaning their cargo faced minimal inspection. The Royal Lao Army, heavily dependent on American aid, avoided interfering with CIA operations. And the Hmong guerrillas, now numbering more than 15,000 by 1963, secured mountain territory against Pathet Lao interference, creating safe zones for poppy cultivation. Traditional opium production in the Golden Triangle, the border region where Burma, Thailand, and Laos meet, had averaged roughly 800 tons annually during the 1950s. By 1963, production exceeded 200 tons. By 1965, it reached 400 tons. The exponential growth directly correlated with improved logistics, expanded cultivation in secure areas, and reliable market access. We weren't just facilitating an existing trade, explained DEA agent Michael Levine, who later investigated Golden Triangle trafficking. We were providing venture capital, transportation infrastructure, and security services. We'd taken a cottage industry and industrialized it. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations maintained plausible deniability through careful information compartmentalization. State Department officials knew about Hmong military recruitment, but not opium purchases. Defense Department planners knew about Air America logistics, but not cargo contents. Congressional appropriations committees knew about covert operations budgets, but not revenue sources. And the American public knew virtually nothing. When journalist Alfred McCoy began investigating the CIA's relationship with Southeast Asian opium in 1971, he encountered obstruction at every level. CIA officers threatened my publisher, McCoy recalled. They claimed I was endangering national security and emboldening the enemy. What I was actually doing was documenting how American agencies had accidentally, or not so accidentally, created the world's most powerful drug trafficking infrastructure. By 1965, as American combat troops arrived in Vietnam and military advisors proliferated throughout Indochina, the foundation was fully laid. The Golden Triangle possessed modern air logistics, secure cultivation zones, reliable buyers, and expanding refinery capacity. All it needed was a massive new customer base. American soldiers would provide that within months. April 1967, Da Nang Air Base, South Vietnam. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, name changed for privacy, returned from a patrol near the DMZ and found something unexpected in his footlocker. 2 small glassine bags filled with white powder left there by a buddy who'd purchased them in Da Nang's Sin City district for $10 each. Pure heroin, stamped with a red dragon logo that would become grimly familiar to military police over the next 5 years. I'd smoked marijuana in the field. Everyone did, Wilson said in a 1973 interview with military investigators. But this was different. This was something that turned scared 19-year-olds into the walking dead. And it was everywhere. Cheaper than beer, easier to hide than pot. Within 6 months, half my platoon was using. The convergence that created America's heroin epidemic began innocuously enough. In 1966, as American troop presence in Vietnam expanded from 190,000 to 389,000, enterprising Corsican and Chinese traffickers in Saigon recognized an unprecedented business opportunity. Hundreds of thousands of young American men, stressed, traumatized, bored, paid regularly, and completely cut off from normal social constraints. Traditional opium smoking dens had served French colonial forces, but the Americans represented a different market. They wanted something portable, quick-acting, and powerful. They wanted heroin. The raw material came from Laos, transported by the same Air America logistics network that supplied CIA operations. But now, instead of moving opium to traditional Southeast Asian markets, the supply chain pivoted towards South Vietnam, specifically to laboratories in Saigon, Vientiane, and increasingly within the Golden Triangle itself. In 1966, you couldn't buy pure heroin in Da Nang, explained CID, Criminal Investigation Division, Agent Robert Martinez. By early 1967, it was sold openly in bars, by shoeshine boys, even by Vietnamese working on base. By 1968, we had a full-blown epidemic. The numbers tell a devastating story. According to Defense Department surveys, 1967, approximately 2% of servicemen in Vietnam reported heroin use. 1969, 11% reported use. 1970, 22% reported use. 1971, 28% reported use, with rates exceeding 40% in some units. At peak addiction levels in 1971, an estimated 25,000 to 40,000 American servicemen in Vietnam were regular heroin users. This represented the largest cohort of heroin addicts the United States had ever seen, and they'd been created within a 4-year period. The mechanics of the trade revealed how completely the CIA's Laotian logistics infrastructure had been hijacked, or perhaps had simply fulfilled its inevitable destiny. Multiple investigations, including the 1972 Steele congressional hearings and later DEA probes, documented the pipeline. Stage 1. Cultivation. Hmong villages in Laos, still under CIA contract and protection, expanded poppy cultivation dramatically. Production in the Golden Triangle increased from approximately 400 tons of raw opium in 1965 to more than 700 tons by 1969. Villages that had grown poppies on family plots now devoted entire terraced hillsides to cultivation. Stage 2. Transportation. Air America flights continued moving agricultural products from Hmong regions to Vientiane and Long Tieng. Some pilots knew exactly what they carried. Others maintained plausible ignorance. Either way, American aircraft provided transportation that traditional pack mule caravans could never match. "I flew those routes for 3 years," said Fred Walker, an Air America pilot who later testified before Congress. "Did I know some of the burlap bags contained opium? Of course. Did anyone tell me to refuse those shipments? Never. Did I think it would end up killing American soldiers? Honestly, no. We thought it was going to the same Chinese and French criminal networks that had existed for decades. We didn't realize we were feeding a monster." Stage 3. Processing. The critical transformation occurred in laboratories that proliferated throughout Southeast Asia between 1967 to 1971. Crude opium requires relatively simple chemistry to convert into heroin, but high-purity heroin demands expertise, equipment, and precursor chemicals. Several factors enabled the rapid establishment of sophisticated heroin labs. First, Corsican chemists, veterans of the French Connection heroin trade through Marseille, relocated operations to Southeast Asia after their traditional Turkish supply routes faced disruption. These experts brought industrial chemistry knowledge that dramatically improved heroin purity. Second, the chaotic wartime environment provided perfect cover. A heroin laboratory requires only a medium-sized building, basic chemistry equipment, and precursor chemicals, acetic anhydride being the most critical. In war-torn Laos and Cambodia, such facilities attracted zero attention from authorities. Third, and most damningly, powerful figures in the South Vietnamese government, the Royal Lao government, and even Thai military and police forces actively protected trafficking operations. Vietnamese Air Force General Nguyen Sao Ky, South Vietnam's prime minister from 1965 to 1967, was repeatedly accused of using Vietnamese military aircraft to transport opium and protect heroin laboratories. Kai denied all allegations. "You have to understand the corruption wasn't incidental," explained CIA officer Ralph McGehee, who worked in Vietnam and later became a whistleblower. "It was structural. We allied with anybody who was anti-communist, regardless of their other activities. That meant drug traffickers, warlords, and utterly corrupt military officers. We gave them money, weapons, and political protection. What did we think they'd do with that power?" Stage 4. Distribution. The heroin reached American soldiers through networks that military police and CID found nearly impossible to disrupt. Vietnamese bar girls, cab drivers, and civilian employees on American bases sold it directly. Some South Vietnamese military officers ran distribution networks through their own troops. And in a particularly bitter irony, some American soldiers themselves became trafficking middlemen, using military mail and even body bags of deceased servicemen to ship heroin to accomplices in the United States. The purity of Vietnam heroin shocked American drug enforcement officials. Street heroin in the United States, typically measured 3 to 5% pure, cut extensively with quinine, lactose, or other adulterants. Vietnam heroin averaged 90 to 96% pure, so potent that soldiers could smoke it rather than inject it, lowering the psychological barrier to use. "You didn't need a needle," explained Wilson. "You could sprinkle it on a cigarette. You could smoke it on aluminum foil. It didn't look like drugs the way we'd been warned about. It just looked like a way to stop being terrified every single day." The battlefield consequences proved catastrophic. Commanders reported units where 40 to 50% of soldiers showed signs of addiction. Needle tracks, dramatic weight loss, inability to function during patrols. Accidental overdoses killed soldiers who'd survived combat. Addicted soldiers endangered their units through impaired judgment and withdrawal symptoms during operations. "We had men falling asleep on watch," said Captain David Morrison, who commanded an infantry company in 1970-71. We had men too sick from withdrawal to carry their weapons properly. We had men who would do anything, sell ammunition, disclose patrol routes, for another fix. Heroin destroyed combat effectiveness more thoroughly than any enemy action. Back in Laos, the CIA watched its carefully constructed system spiral out of control. The Hmong army, originally intended to fight the Pathet Lao, had become a crucial component in a heroin supply chain that was destroying American military capability in Vietnam. Air America, designed to supply anti-communist guerrillas, had become, however inadvertently, the transportation backbone for international narcotics trafficking. Some CIA officers protested internally. Theodore Shackley, CIA station chief in Vientiane from 1966-1968, later claimed he ordered investigations into Air America drug flights. But the evidence suggests these efforts were perfunctory at best. The fundamental problem remained. The CIA's mission in Laos depended on Hmong cooperation, and Hmong cooperation depended on the opium economy. Breaking that connection would mean abandoning the entire covert operation. We knew about the heroin epidemic in Vietnam by 1968, admitted Thomas Polgar, a senior CIA officer in Southeast Asia. We knew our logistics infrastructure was being used for trafficking. But the alternative was admitting failure in Laos, abandoning our indigenous forces, and telling Washington that a decade of covert operations had been predicated on a narcotics trafficking alliance. Nobody wanted to write that memo. The turning point arrived on June 17, 1971, when President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and announced the creation of the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention. Under pressure from Congress and increasingly vocal veterans groups, the Pentagon commissioned comprehensive studies of heroin addiction among Vietnam servicemen. The findings were devastating. The Robbins study, published in 1974, followed a cohort of Vietnam veterans and found that 20% had tried heroin in Vietnam, with 10% developing serious addiction. When these soldiers returned home, they brought their habits and their connections to Southeast Asian supply sources with them. We'd created a market that didn't exist before, said Dr. Jerome Jaffe, Nixon's drug policy advisor. Before Vietnam, heroin addiction was largely confined to inner-city minority populations, with relatively small numbers. Vietnam gave us a generation of white, working-class addicts from suburbs and small towns. It democratized heroin addiction across American society. The irony was inescapable. The CIA's anti-communist operations in Laos had created the infrastructure that destroyed American military effectiveness in Vietnam and exported heroin addiction to the United States. The attempt to stop communist expansion through indigenous proxy forces had, through its dependence on the opium economy, inflicted more damage on American power than the Viet Cong ever could. By 1970, the Golden Triangle drug empire had evolved beyond anyone's control, including the CIA's. What began as a marriage of convenience between American intelligence and Hmong subsistence farmers had metastasized into a self-sustaining criminal enterprise with international reach, sophisticated refining capacity, and political protection at the highest levels of Southeast Asian governments. The infrastructure matures, 1969-1973. The logistics network that had moved raw opium now supported fully integrated narcotics production. Heroin laboratories proliferated throughout the region, but particularly in Burma's Shan state, where former Kuomintang, KMT Chinese nationalist forces, remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's army who'd fled to Burma after the 1949 Communist Revolution, controlled vast territories beyond Burmese government reach. These KMT forces, ironically also recipients of CIA support during the 1950s, part of anti-communist operations against China, had transformed from defeated military units into drug cartels. Leaders like General Tuan Shi Wen and General Li Wen Huan commanded private armies numbering in the thousands, controlled mountain territories where the Burmese government had no authority, and operated heroin refineries with industrial efficiency. The KMT labs could process 10-15 tons of opium into heroin weekly, explained DEA agent Richard Bly, who conducted surveillance operations in the Golden Triangle during the 1970s. They had Chinese chemists trained in industrial organic chemistry. They had access to precursor chemicals through Thai and Burmese black markets. And they had military protection that made interdiction virtually impossible. The scale of operations dwarfed anything that had existed in the 1960s. A fully equipped heroin laboratory required reinforced buildings with ventilation systems. Acetic anhydride fumes are toxic. Large cooking vessels and condensation equipment. Acetylation reagents and purification chemicals. Packaging facilities with heat sealers and stamping equipment. Armed security forces, typically 100 to 200 soldiers per major facility. The largest refineries operated like legitimate factories. Workers arrived for scheduled shifts. Raw materials were inventoried. Quality control tested product purity. Finished heroin was packaged in standardized quantities with brand logos. The Red Dragon, the WO Globe, the Tiger's Head, that became internationally recognized. The CIA's impossible position, 1970-1973. As congressional pressure intensified and media exposés multiplied, the CIA faced an impossible dilemma. The agency could not simultaneously 1. Maintain its anti-communist operations in Laos. 2. Honor its alliance with Hmong forces dependent on opium revenue. 3. Combat the heroin epidemic destroying the American military. Richard Helms, CIA director from 1966 to 1973, walked a diplomatic tightrope. In classified briefings to Congress, he emphasized that CIA operations did not encourage or facilitate narcotics trafficking. In internal memos, he acknowledged that indigenous forces under agency support are involved in activities the agency cannot fully control. The semantics fooled nobody. Air America flights continued. Long Tieng remained operational. Vang Pao, by now a general commanding 30,000 Hmong fighters and de facto warlord of northwestern Laos, maintained his power base through a combination of CIA support and opium revenue. We'd created a monster we couldn't kill without destroying our own operations, admitted Frank Snepp. Vang Pao controlled territory we needed to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He provided intelligence on North Vietnamese movements. His forces rescued downed American pilots. How could we tell him, "Thanks for your service, but we're shutting down your economy"? We couldn't. So we didn't. The Paris Peace Accords, January 1973, and subsequent American withdrawal from Southeast Asia should have ended CIA involvement in Laotian opium. It didn't. The agency continued supporting Hmong forces through Thai intermediaries and third-party contractors. Air America officially ceased operations in 1974. But private aviation companies with suspiciously similar capabilities and familiar personnel emerged immediately to fill the gap. The warlord era, 1973 to 1989. The American departure didn't collapse the Golden Triangle drug trade. It liberated it. Without even the pretense of American oversight, heroin production exploded. The major players in this era became legends of international narcotics trafficking. Khun Sa, Chan Chi-fu, a Shan warlord who, by the late 1970s, controlled an estimated 70% of Burma's opium production. His Hmong Thai army numbered 20,000 soldiers, operated from a fortified headquarters called Ho Mong, beautiful Hmongland, and functioned as a quasi-government in Shan State. Khun Sa offered repeatedly to sell his entire opium crop to the U.S. government for $6 million annually, a proposition DEA officials found both audacious and darkly humorous. Khun Sa understood economics perfectly, said DEA agent Michael Levine. He told us, "You want to stop heroin? Buy my opium. I'll sell it to you cheaper than I sell to traffickers. He wasn't wrong. $6 million annually to control the source was far cheaper than the billions we spent on interdiction. But American policy couldn't accept paying a drug lord, even if it made economic sense. Lo Sing-han, a KMT-aligned warlord who built a vertically integrated operation from poppy cultivation through heroin refining to international distribution. His organization maintained representatives in Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Amsterdam. He pioneered the use of commercial shipping containers to move heroin in multi-hundred-kilogram shipments rather than the kilogram-level quantities that earlier traffickers had managed. The Nguyen Han Bank connection. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that former CIA operatives continued facilitating Golden Triangle operations through ostensibly legitimate businesses. The Nguyen Han Bank, an Australian merchant bank that collapsed in 1980, was revealed to have laundered enormous drug proceeds. Its directors included former CIA Director William Colby, former Air America pilots, and former military intelligence officers. The institutional knowledge didn't disappear when America left Southeast Asia, explained journalist Jonathan Quitney, who investigated the Nguyen Han scandal. The personal relationships, the smuggling routes, the political connections, they all continued. Except now they operated for private profit rather than anti-communist objectives. The CIA's infrastructure had been privatized. The human cost in Laos. While international traffickers grew wealthy, the Hmong people, those same mountain villagers the CIA had recruited in 1961, suffered catastrophically. The Vietnam War's end brought communist victory in Laos. The Pathet Lao government, taking power in 1975, viewed the Hmong as American collaborators and CIA puppets. Brutal reprisals followed. Tens of thousands of Hmong fled across the Mekong River into Thailand, where they languished in refugee camps. Vang Pao escaped to the United States in 1975, along with approximately 2,000 senior Hmong leaders and their families, in an evacuation operation coordinated by the CIA. But the vast majority, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 Hmong, remained in Laos, facing persecution, poverty, and a collapsed economy now that their American patrons had departed. The CIA promised us protection, said Yang Dao, a Hmong intellectual who escaped to France. They promised that America would never abandon its allies. But when the war ended, we were expendable. They took their generals and their collaborators and left everyone else to face retribution. The opium economy, which we'd been encouraged to expand to support the American war effort, now made us targets for the communist government. The bitter irony: Hmong farmers who'd grown poppies at CIA encouragement now faced eradication campaigns by the new Laotian government, campaigns that were ineffective because the drug infrastructure had become too profitable and too well protected to eliminate. From Southeast Asian heroin to the Chinese connection, 1980s, 1990s. By the mid-1980s, Golden Triangle heroin dominated world markets. The China white heroin from Southeast Asian labs, so-called for its distinctive white color indicating high purity, commanded premium prices and captured an estimated 60 to 70% of the American heroin market. The irony of China white bearing that name while being produced largely by Chinese warlords and trafficked through Chinese triads would have been darkly humorous if not for the hundreds of thousands of American addicts it created. The distribution networks extended from mountain laboratories to New York street corners through sophisticated international smuggling operations. The Thai connection. Bangkok became the primary transshipment hub. Heroin moved through Suvarnabhumi Airport before enhanced security, in luggage, shipping containers, and even diplomatic pouches belonging to corrupt Thai officials. The Hong Kong route. Triads in Hong Kong, particularly the 14K and Sun Yian organizations, controlled distribution throughout Asia and to Chinese diaspora communities worldwide. They pioneered the use of commercial fishing vessels to move multi-hundred-kilogram shipments. The diplomatic advantage. Multiple investigations revealed that diplomats, military attachés, and government officials from Burma, Laos, and Thailand used their immunity to transport heroin. A 1989 investigation exposed a Thai diplomat in New York who'd smuggled more than 100 kilograms of heroin in diplomatic pouches over a 2-year period. The scale staggered law enforcement. A single successful shipment, say 200 kilograms of pure heroin concealed in a shipping container of furniture, could generate $50–100 million in street-level sales after being cut and distributed. The profit margins made cocaine trafficking look almost reasonable by comparison. By 1960, the Golden Triangle drug empire had reached a paradoxical apex. Unprecedented production capacity, sophisticated international distribution, and political protection at the highest levels. All built on infrastructure that American agencies had helped create and could no longer control. The numbers that tell the story. Annual opium production in the Golden Triangle peaked at approximately 2,500–2,800 tons during 1989–1991, according to DEA and State Department estimates. To contextualize, that quantity, when refined into heroin, represented enough to supply every heroin addict in the United States for multiple years. The scale had increased roughly 30-fold since the early 1960s, when the CIA first began its operations in Laos. The financial magnitude was equally staggering. A comprehensive 1990 study by the Rand Corporation estimated that Golden Triangle heroin generated $200 to $300 billion annually in global retail sales, accounting for cutting and distribution markups. Even if traffickers captured only 10–15% of that retail value, which is conservative, the drug lords of Burma, Laos, and Thailand were collectively earning $20 to $30 billion yearly. For comparison, Burma's entire legitimate GDP in 1990 was approximately $8 billion. We'd created an enterprise more profitable than most national economies, said DEA Administrator Robert Bonner in congressional testimony. And it was fundamentally invulnerable to traditional law enforcement because it operated in territories where governments had no effective authority. The operational reality. The mature Golden Triangle trafficking networks operated with corporate-level sophistication. Khun Sa's Hmong Thai army, for instance, maintained professional administrative staff who managed crop purchasing, laboratory operations, and shipping logistics. Telecommunications equipment, satellite phones, radios, superior to the Burmese military's capabilities. Airstrips capable of handling small cargo aircraft for direct shipment to international buyers. Political protection through payoffs to Burmese, Thai, and Chinese officials estimated at $50–100 million annually. A single major laboratory in Shan State could process 10–15 tons of raw opium into 1 or 1.5 tons of refined heroin weekly. The largest facilities operated continuously, with multiple processing lines running simultaneously. The industry had achieved what military strategists would call maturity. Sustainable, efficient, and largely immune to external disruption. Why the empire couldn't be destroyed. Despite decades of effort and billions spent on interdiction, eradication, and enforcement, the Golden Triangle drug empire proved nearly indestructible for multiple reasons. Geography as fortress. The Golden Triangle encompasses some of the world's most impenetrable terrain. Jungle mountains, river valleys accessible only by foot or air, and borders that exist more as political fictions than enforceable boundaries. Moving troops into these regions to destroy laboratories and poppy fields required logistical capabilities that neither Burma, Laos, nor Thailand possessed. The same geography that made the region valuable for CIA anti-communist operations made it perfect for drug production. Political protection at state level. The most damning reality was that elements within the governments of Burma, Thailand, and Laos actively protected and profited from the drug trade. Multiple investigations documented. Burmese military officers who provided weapons and security to drug armies in exchange for payments and profit sharing. Thai police and military officials who protected smuggling routes and warned traffickers about enforcement operations. Banking officials throughout the region who laundered drug proceeds through official financial systems. You can't combat narcotics trafficking when the government is the trafficking organization, explained State Department official Mathia Falco. And in much of the Golden Triangle, that's exactly the situation we faced. The distinction between government officials and drug lords wasn't just blurred. In many cases, it didn't exist. Economic dependency. For millions of people in the Golden Triangle, opium cultivation represented the difference between subsistence survival and starvation. The poppy crop brought cash to regions that had no other viable cash crops, no infrastructure, no access to markets, and no government services. Eradication programs that destroyed poppy fields without providing genuine economic alternatives simply displaced cultivation to different valleys. A 1992 study by the UN Drug Control Program found that poppy eradication in Thailand merely shifted cultivation to Burma and Laos. The total regional production remained essentially unchanged. The poppies just moved to more remote and less accessible locations. The American complicity that wouldn't die. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Golden Triangle's persistence was evidence that American intelligence agencies continued maintaining relationships with drug trafficking organizations well into the 1980s and 1990s, when such connections could no longer be justified by anti-communist imperatives. The Iran-Contra investigations revealed that drug traffickers had been used to support anti-communist forces in Central America, demonstrating that the "will tolerate drug trafficking for strategic purposes" mindset survived Vietnam. Senator John Kerry's 1988 investigation into drug trafficking and Central American covert operations concluded that individuals who provided support for the Contras were involved in drug trafficking, and elements of the Contras themselves knowingly received financial and material assistance from drug traffickers. The parallels to Southeast Asia were explicit and intentional. The same institutional logic that produced the Golden Triangle, strategic objectives trumped narcotics enforcement, continued to operate decades after the Vietnam War ended. In 1996, Khun Sa surrendered to Burmese authorities in a carefully negotiated arrangement that allowed him to retire in Yangon, keep his fortune, and avoid prosecution. He lived comfortably until his death in 2007, never facing charges for decades of drug trafficking. His surrender marked the symbolic end of the warlord era, but not the end of Golden Triangle heroin production. The infrastructure remained, the trafficking networks persisted, and the fundamental economic incentives, impoverished farmers, insatiable demand, and enormous profit margins, continued to drive opium cultivation. Today, the Golden Triangle has been supplanted by Afghanistan as the world's primary opium producer. But the patterns established in Southeast Asia persist. American military operations intersecting with drug cultivation zones, local forces dependent on narcotics revenue, and intelligence agencies maintaining plausible deniability about the trafficking their presence facilitates. The final accounting reveals what one CIA officer paid in opium in 1962 actually purchased. Not a military victory, not strategic success, but rather the transformation of subsistence, poppy cultivation, into industrial-scale narcotics production that killed tens of thousands of Americans, addicted hundreds of thousands more, and created criminal enterprises that persist into the 21st century. "We thought we were buying a guerrilla army," reflected William Colby shortly before his death in 1996. "What we actually bought was the heroin epidemic that destroyed a generation of American soldiers and devastated American cities for decades. That's what the opium paid for. The Hmong people, those mountain villagers whose loyalty the CIA purchased with opium purchases, remain scattered across the world. Approximately 260,000 Hmong refugees eventually resettled in the United States, where they built communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and California. Many remain economically marginalized, struggling with poverty, trauma, and the knowledge that their service to America brought them persecution and exile, rather than gratitude. Back in Nam U, Laos, that village where Bill Young first agreed to buy opium in January 1962, poppy fields still bloom white and purple each winter. The CIA departed decades ago. The promised development never arrived. And the opium economy, which American agencies helped industrialize, remains the only reliable source of cash in mountains where roads still barely exist and electricity remains sporadic. One CIA agent paid Laotian villagers with opium purchases. The price America paid in addiction, corruption, and moral compromise continues to compound interest.